Hello and welcome to Tea with Jess. I'm author Jess Montgomery, and I'm delighted you're joining me for a little tea break today. As Nana says in my kinship mystery series, life is hard, have tea. And my tea mug today is actually a mug from the Cincinnati Reds from a bunch of years ago. It's my husband and one of our daughters. They'd actually ended up going to a no-hitter. So that's where the mug came from. But today I'm welcoming Dayton, Ohio's beloved poet laureate, Dr. Herbert Woodward Martin, who is known for his own work, as well as his recitations of the work of another beloved Dayton poet, Paul Laurence Dunbar. After earning degrees at University of Toledo and Breadloff School of English, teaching at Aquinas College in Michigan, and publishing his first book of poetry, Dr. Martin became poet in residence and assistant professor at University of Dayton in 1970. Since then, Martin earned a doctorate of arts at Carnegie Mellon University, published numerous volumes of his own poetry, has become a scholar on Dunbar and others, and has won accolades including a Fulbright Scholarship, the Ohio Governor's Award for an Individual Artist, an honorary PhD from the University of Dayton, and many other accolades. His most recent poetry collections are Sometimes Say My Name and The Shape of Regret. Herbert is also has had a successful career as a librettist, working with American composers such as Adolphus Hailstork on an opera, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Common Ground. He composed the text for Nobody Knows, a concert aria by Hailstork, and commissioned by the Harlem Chamber Players to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first Africans brought to America as slaves, and premiered by the Players in February of 2019. And most recently, he wrote the text for Tulsa 1921 about the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre of Black Americans in the Greenwood district of Tulsa. With such an amazing legacy, it's perhaps surprising that Herbert is so wonderfully down to earth, as you're soon going to see. Well, at least until you actually meet him or read his poetry, and then realize that though he is down to earth, he's also deeply in touch with the emotions and experiences that connect all humans. So now I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Herbert Woodward Martin to Tea with Jess.
Well, thank you.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. I'm glad you're here. Show us your mug. I want to see what mug you have for your tea.
Wait, I'm doing it wrong. There we go. Here we are.
Tea with herbs. That is perfect. I love that. What are you working on these days, whether in poetry or in as a librettist?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm revising a lot of poems and hoping that I think out of all of the manuscripts that I'm collecting right now, there might be 3 manuscripts in all, and that'll bring my total of output up to 15 books. So I'm really
that's amazing.
But I'm doing it anyway, and then we'll see what happens. So that's on the back burner, and I would do it faster if, like the old poets, I had a secretary that you shovel the poems, but I don't, so I have to hunt and peck and do the best I can. So that's where I am right now. And I'm waiting for March and April of 2022 to come. So.
Okay. And why are you waiting for March and April of 22 to?
Well, in March, the world premiere of A Knee on the Neck, which is a cantata, and it has been set by Adolphus Hailstork again. Mm-hmm. And the New York, it's the New Philharmonic Orchestra in the state of New York, and they will premiere the work in March. So I'm sort of holding my breath and and looking forward to that. It'll be with full orchestra, a choir, and three soloists, I understand. So,
Wow. And was this inspired by the tragedy of George Floyd, I'm assuming?
yes, it was. And the Harlem String Players, which is a group of people in New York, based in Harlem, they commissioned me to write the text. And I did that. And then they sent it off to Adolphus Hailstork, who liked it very much and immediately proceeded to set it to music. I, in the meantime, got worried as the trial went on, and I said, "Can I add you more text?" And he said, "Oh, no, 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 no," and threw up his hands. He said, "I have enough." And so I thought, well, the composer says that's it, and so I left it at that. So it's easy enough to do that when the composer knows exactly what it is he wants, right, and goes about his business, and I can get on with my plans.
So will you be traveling to New York to see
I am hoping that I'm still in good health and will be able to go to New York for the premiere.
Oh, I hope so too. Yeah. And you said that's in March.
Yeah, that's, I think March 22nd comes into my mind.
Okay.
And then in April will be another premiere, but that one will take place on the West Coast at the University of Washington in Seattle. A new premiere, and I think it's called Five Poems by Herbert Woodward Martin. And it was set by Malia Watrous, who is the daughter of a late professor in education at UD. So she wrote and asked if I would let her use my poems, and I said, fine. And then, of course, the composition grew and grew, and she needed more poems. So I sent her 3 more. And so that will show up in April of 2022.
Wow.
And so I'm not planning to get myself to Washington State, but if I do, it'll be on the QT. So I don't want anybody to do anything, but just let me come and go as quietly as I can.
Oh, well, that's so exciting, though. That's amazing. And you mentioned that you're, as you're anticipating these wonderful events in the spring, that you're putting together possibly 3 collections.
Yeah.
From your work, which would bring you up to 15 total. So that means you've had 12 collections published, if I'm doing my math correctly.
Maybe 12. The Shape of Regret was number 10. And then during the pandemic came Sometimes Say My Name. And that was number 11. So I think 12, 13, 14, maybe 15, but I don't know.
We'll find out.
We will, yeah.
Eventually.
If I type fast enough,
There you go. Well, tell us about The Shape of Regret and about Sometimes Say My Name. Tell us what those collections are, the themes those collections are built around.
Yeah, those Sometimes Say My Name was a publication prize, and it comes from the I'm trying to think of the poet William. It's not William Stafford. I'll think of it, but it's his foundation left after he passed away. He was a poet laureate of the whole country, and so somebody recommended me, and I fell into the trap, and I typed up the manuscript and sent it. But all of this happened during the pandemic, and it's a full poem a book of poems about a black man who was a dishwasher, and I've forgotten whether it was New York or another city. He fell ill, went to the hospital. They found out, taking the blood test, that he had AIDS, and indeed was dying. And his family, if I understand it correctly, all abandoned him. And so he just wrote a little one-line sentence saying, "Sometimes say my name." And I read that in, I think it was Newsweek, or maybe it was Time, I'm not sure. But they did an entire book devoted to people who were dying from AIDS, and who had contributed and who were artists and dancers and actors, and people who did not have any kind of notoriety or fame at all. And this man's picture sort of jumped out at me and caught me. And so that's how I came with the title, "Sometimes Say My Name." But it took a lot of revision because the poem was set up in what we would call typical poem-like stanzas. And for some reason, all of that changed as I began to type, and it turned into prose poems. So it's an entire book of prose poems, with the exception of one poem, which is set up with a sharp left side, but a squiggly right side. So that's the only one that comes out as a poem. Everything else is prose. So, and I can't tell you why I suddenly, as I retyped it, typed everything in prose. So, but there it is.
That's where your muse led you.
Yes, and I tend to follow the poem and ask the poem, "Why do you want to be prose rather than prose?" It never answers, so I don't know.
So do you get into a bit of a dialogue with the piece you're creating and listen to it?
Yeah, I do. I try to find out where the poem wants to go, rather than with a heavy hand saying, "You will go down this road or this path," rather than that one. And usually what happens is I'm surprised sometimes by veering off to the left or to the right and ending up where I hadn't intended to go, but finding that that has been a perhaps more fruitful journey than the one that I wanted to take. And so I tend to follow the poem and try to find out what the poem is telling me, rather than I tell the poem, you will do this, you will do that.
I like that. You know, you're trusting your subconscious.
Yeah.
You're not trying to, you're not going into the work with a preset agenda, or if you are, you quickly let it fade and let. Right. Yeah, I like that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm willing to gamble
with words.
Sure. Yeah.
I like that. Gamble with words. Yeah. And then The Shape of Regret. Give us a quick synopsis of.
Yeah, that one it's set up like traditional poems, and I think it's set on the desk or in the incoming pile at Wayne State University, and for a year, maybe a year and a half, and finally I thought to write and ask them what their disposition was about the manuscript, and they said, "We're publishing it." And so it came out literally in 2019, just before the pandemic hit us.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I went to Detroit, and I read, and then on my way back home, the country was closing down, and I thought, well, I just made it, and so everything happened as it were, to me during the pandemic. Those two books came out. I had one reading which didn't get canceled. It just made it under the wire. And it was with a Zoom audience in Florida. And then everything else fell off of the wires, as it were.
Yeah.
So.
But you have managed to stay a bit busy nonetheless.
Yeah, I am. And now the readings are beginning to pick up again. So I'm happy about that. And I just do them as they come. So those, and I think that book of poems was simply about the fact that whatever it was that I had done, I thought there's no reason that you should regret it. It's just there, and you should live with it, come what may. And so that is why it is called the Shape of Regret. But I'm sort of tossing all that off my shoulders rather than trying to feel bad about that, because it's all done. It's water under the bridge, as it were, and why worry about it? Nothing I can do. Yeah,
I like that. Well, it seems to me that I mean, I don't know. I've never been a librettist, but I would guess. So correct me if I'm wrong. That writing the text for operas and other music would draw upon your work as a poet, and vice versa. So I'm curious how much the two forms have in common for you, and how much they differ.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think for me, I found myself being in that position is really kind of surprising. Years and years ago, I wrote what I thought was a text for an opera, and the composer, who is now deceased, I sent it to him, and he didn't much like it. And I came to understand that it was more like stick figures. And I found that out studying with Edward Albee. He liked the mother's voice, but he didn't like anything else because they didn't come alive for him. And so I abandoned the project. Didn't go back to it at all. Suddenly found myself advising Adolphus about which poems of Dunbar should be set for our Common Ground opera. And from there on, he wrote and said, "Would you write me a text on Christmas attucks?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll do that." And I just sort of wrote him something and sent it, and he really liked it. He said it for chorus, orchestra, and I think baritone and a mezzo soprano, and that did quite well. And I thought, oh well, that's very nice, and I didn't pay any attention to it at all. And suddenly, there was this Tulsa people asking me to do, or the Harlem string people asking me to do the text on Tulsa. And I found that was really difficult because the city fathers had so squelched all of the information about that incident that it was not even recorded in any of the encyclopedias. So I could find very, very, very little information. And I finally had to go back to the old newspapers from Tulsa. And there it was, that they had this riot, and all of the white people had just simply burned down the entire section that was allotted to the black people. And they were pretty self-sufficient group of people. They had their own banks and their own hospitals and doctors and what have you, but everything was completely obliterated, and only a few people who managed to get clear of, the Holocaust, as it were, managed to save themselves and to keep the history alive. But everything else was completely taken. So that one came by, and the mezzo soprano Janai Bridges sang the entire piece with orchestra, and it was premiered uh, on Juneteenth, 2020. So
Perfect.
I sort of remember that one for that reason.
Yeah, that's wow. That's an amazing story, and what an experience to do that research.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, but you, if I'm remembering correctly from past conversations, you are a singer, and you studied singing, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. So how did the study of singing impact you as a poet? Do you find echoes from that experience coming
Well,
out in your poetry?
yeah, I think that's a good question because what happens is um, I am mindful of what it is that a singer, what kind of words a singer can sing and best communicate with his or her audience. And so I try not to put 15 syllable words in the poem because unless I'm being humorous, it's not
Ah,
going to work. Uh, and I'm mindful of the kinds of songs, whether I was singing in German or whether I was singing in English, uh, what words would best communicate. So that I think informs my writing of the text, but
mhm.
nobody's ever asked me. And so I've never ever said, because I'm a singer, I think that this word is better than a normal word for conversation. So I'm making choices, but
Mhm.
I'm doing it as a singer rather than as a lecturer. And
Yeah.
so I think that that way I give the singer something that he or she can get their teeth in, and at the same time not look or feel foolish while they're singing the song. So
Right.
but
Well, and it occurs to me that, poetry is
it,
traditional poetry is meant to both be read
yes,
by your
and
audience, but also listened to by a poet's audience.
yeah, and then I tend to think in that sense I do follow a line that has a kind of musical phrase,
Hmm.
and to lend itself to hearing and to being spoken as well. So both those things come in and impact the text as I'm writing it. But I'm not really conscious of, oh, this is a singleable word. I'm not sure that that's it because I'm still asking the text which way does it want to go, uh,
Sure.
and uh, and I'm trying to follow that text to see what's going to happen. Um,
Yeah. And your text could have a sense of humor and say, "How about this 15 syllable word? That's what we're going
yeah.
to use." Oh, so we've talked a lot about your work as a poet and a librettist, but you also have brought Paul Lawrence Dunbar. I mentioned him at the top as one of our beloved poets in
Sure.
Dayton. You've brought him back to life in recitations of his work and your scholarship on his work.
Hmm.
So, could you share how you came to his work and maybe talk
Yeah.
also a little bit about how being connected to his work might have affected your work?
Yeah. One of the things that I discovered about Dunbar, I rediscovered it, and it's all because of Alan Tate, who told me years ago, reading at Wright State University, that I needed to have an old guy in my repertoire. Well, I wasn't sure what he meant by that because in those days, like all of the poets in my generation, we only read our work and
Hmm.
nobody else's when somebody asked us to give a poetry reading.
Hmm.
So he was mindful of telling me that. And I thought, well, I've got to pay attention to him. He must have some clue about this. But I didn't know what he meant. And it was a year later that I heard Margaret Walker read Dunbar. And she read five of the longest of Dunbar's poems. And two of them were in dialect. And it just left the audience stunned and in stitches. And I thought, oh my, I haven't heard that since I left Alabama. Oh, well, that guy must be your old guy. And you've now got to go back and relearn all of the dialect that you sort of put to a side as you tried to learn how to become an American poet rather than a black poet. And so that's what I did. I went back and relearned the dialect. And it really was a matter of simply sounding out the word and thinking, oh, what he's really saying is something that's in conversation, and it's black speech rather than American speech. And that's all you need to figure out. And once I did that, I found all those humorous poems that he sort of wrote and hoped that people would understand and put them aside. But now it's strange because only Dunbar and Mark Twain are the principal writers in black dialect. And nobody seems to, and Dunbar gets second place, and Twain is the American novelist because he wrote in black dialect, in white speech, and then in pretend English speech, which has to assume that you have the right pronunciation for the English dialect as well when he comes to the king and the ne'er-do-well in his book. So all of that played into it, and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting that the country can deal with Twain, but not with Dunbar.
Right.
And I think that the African American scholars of the 30s and the 40s has a little to do with that because they wanted nothing to do with dialect at all. It was second rate, and it seemed as if you were uneducated if you used it. So they may have put the kibosh on Dunbar and his use of dialect.
And yet there's such beauty in the dialect.
Yes, and when I read them, there are people who do know that and who do know the dialect, and I can oftentimes spot somebody in the audience who knows that poem because they memorized it as a child in school.
Interesting.
So
you can kind of tell because of the expression on their face, or
yes,
wow.
And because they are mouthing the words with me, they know it, and so I say to myself, be careful because that person knows the right text, and you can't slip up and add something to the text that isn't there. So that keeps me on my toes.
Yeah, that definitely would. But at the same time, what a lovely connection between you and that person, and you've recreated Dunbar in the room that way.
Sure. Yeah.
That's neat.
There's a gentleman who sees me at the grocery store, and he says, "How do you do, Mr. Dunbar?" I sort of laugh and smile, but but we have this private joke running between the two of us, so that's nice. But go ahead.
That is nice. Well, I was going to ask you about. You've already shared thoughts and tips about creation. I'm definitely going to be following my own work more now than trying to get out a hammer.
Sure, yeah.
But what thoughts or ideas do you, or wisdom or advice would you give to people who want to write poetry, or even for people who I think often readers are a little afraid of, like, poetry seems so intimidating to them for some readers. So, both for people who want to read poetry who haven't perhaps since their school days, and for people who want to write poetry, what advice would you give?
Well, I heard Gwendolyn Brooks say once, you have to be very, very careful what the muse leaves you with, because she's kind of fickle. She stops at 4 or 5 poets and she tells them the same thing. And so once you get your idea, you have to really remake it and enhance it and do something really quite unexpected with what you've been given, because there are 4 other people out there who have similar ideas and probably will approach it in similar ways. So you have to make something out of that poem. And so that always sits on my shoulder and whispers in my ear saying, be careful now, somebody else got the same idea. And so you have to make it as original and as fresh as possible. So I would say to that person who wants to write, look at the idea that you have been given and then try to put it in a voice that is comfortable for you. The way in which that person may talk may be different from the way you speak, but try and approach it from that angle and then see where that leads you. Then try to clean up the metaphors and the similes and make them unusual and make them as fresh as possible. So you have voice and rhythm and tone, and whether or not you want the poem to rhyme. So that's about 5 things that you have to juggle. And if you're a good juggler, you toss all of these things in the air, and after a while, they all look as if you are swinging them on a piece of rope or whatever, or string, but they are all equally separated from each other. And you keep them perfectly positioned as you juggle. So that's a real trick for, the poet to be the juggler of those words, but the juggler of those rhythms, the juggler of those sentences, and to keep everything in order, voice, rhythm, and tone. So that's the other thing that I would say underlines every poet's poem. And if you're good at it, you get really pretty good at it, and you know when the speaker is saying this thing correctly, and when it's not quite right. I underline the word, and then I think, okay, come back to that and find the accurate word or one that fits in that place so that you can read it without stumbling over it, or as if it is a brick that you could not quite handle. So I think that those are the things that I would best advise a beginning writer to handle. If you're a reader, then you're reading dialect, or you're reading prose, and you're reading speech, and whether it's fiction or whether it is a drama or a play, you've got to give that character his or her due by inserting the right rhythm to their speech. Nobody speaks in exactly the same way, and so you've got to let the prose come through, and when it's dialogue, it's conversation, and so you've got to figure that one out, and that may be why I've never written a novel, is because you have to have that conversation, and you have to have that person be as accurate as he or she wants to be. But if you're a reader, you can read that, and you can sometimes say those words out loud for yourself, and hear the difference, and that's incumbent on the reader who is reading anyone's novel or anyone's short story, or any actor who is picking up somebody's new play.
Okay. Well, those are great thoughts. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thank you to everybody who joined us today for Tea with Jess. We're going to wrap up now, but until our next tea break, take care of yourself and your loved ones, and have fun.